Vance, thank you so much. General Petraeus, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Delighted to be able to be here and spend some time in the company of the Great Hertog program with my friend, my colleague, someone I'm privileged to consider a mentor, and an extraordinary leader in his own right, General David Petraeus, someone who needs no introduction. And unusually, for the sake of time, I will not give an introduction for this particular evening. But Dave, look, thanks so much for your willingness to join this conversation. As you know, I'm going to be having a seminar later this year on the topic of great leaders and great biographies about those leaders, and some things that we've talked about over the years, and many times comparing notes on books that we both love and biographies. I wanted to begin by actually just asking you to reflect a bit on some of the biographies that have been the most impactful and meaningful for you.
Well, first of all, Vince, it's a privilege to be with you, shipmate, as always. And it is really an honor, actually, to do anything that's associated with Roger Hertog, whose vision you really are operationalizing here, and whose vision is operationalized by a variety of other programs that bear his name at the Institute for the Study of War, the New York Historical Society. In fact, come to think of it, there is a Petraeus Hertog lecture series at the New York Historical Society. I'm very, very privileged to recall. You know, when you ask about the biographies, it's interesting because what it really triggers is not just what were the great biographies, but in some cases it's when did I come across them and why were they meaningful for me? And I'll give you an example. Grant Takes Command by Bruce Catton, a classic of Civil War literature, but not one that I'd actually read until literally I was in the early weeks of the surge. It was given to me as a gift when I was leaving Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where that was my second 3-star assignment, where we did the counterinsurgency field manual and other preparatory tasks, then went back to Iraq for the surge as a 4-star general. Somehow that book ended up in a rucksack and ended up on the table by my bunk. I started reading a few pages just out of curiosity at night. And I found it absolutely inspirational, incredibly instructive, just very, very relevant to what I was doing. I don't want to equate the surge in Iraq to the American Civil War, but there were a lot of similarities in that experience. To be the leader of something in which your country is really focused, to have the tough casualties, to experience congressional delegations, to get calls from the White House, you know, when is this thing going to turn around? All of that really was very, very similar in many respects. And I just found Grant's example, again, truly inspirational, and it gave me fortitude and energy and all the rest of that. So that's, I think, when you ask that question, again, it's not just what was a great biography, but in a sense, when did I read it? Why was it meaningful? I read, for example, Wellington, The Years of the Sword by Elizabeth Longford while teaching at West Point. Now, this was in a period of reflection. You know, I have the academic years. I was teaching a couple of courses, certainly, and trying to finish my dissertation and a few other things. But, you know, it gave an opportunity to sit back and to think about some of the truly great captains throughout history. And Wellington was one of those. I'll come back to the idea that there are very, very, very few generals in history who were brilliant in combat at the tactical level, that's division level and below, multiple brigades. At the operational level, that's a corps of multiple divisions. Our dog strongly agrees with that point. And then at the strategic level, where you are literally the one developing the campaign, as frankly I was in Iraq, or as, again, Grant did, or Wellington did first in Spain, where he also fought in the tactical level, operational level, also in India. And again, he really had that special touch. We'll talk about that a bit later, I think. And it gave me, again, some kind of inspiration that, you know, as Napoleon said, every soldier carries a field marshal's baton in his rucksack. In other words, you've got to be ready. You never know when the call could come, Petraeus or field marshal. And this was one of those that gave me that sense. So I devoured those kind of books. I read about Douglas MacArthur, American Caesar. I mean, even the great title by a great biographer, William Manchester, and great insights into someone who is, who was both exceptional and exceptionally complex, and certainly not without ego, to put it mildly. I forget how many takes he did before he was satisfied with the photograph of him returning to the Philippines, wading through the water. The wonderful multi-volume biography of George C. Marshall by Forrest Pogue. And again, Marshall truly, there's certain aspects of Marshall, the coldness, the formality of him. He can never remember people's names. He was not one, to put an arm around or give energy, none of that. But the example and the thought, he stopped voting, for example. He was truly nonpartisan. It helped him enormously with presidents of different parties over the years. I stopped voting as a two-star, in large part because of that, not just the example, but because of the ideas behind it. And that's what this is always all about, I think. One of our heroes, Henry Kissinger, a biography that he might not embrace. In fact, Walter Isaacson, the author, one of the great authors of contemporary times on a variety of subjects, and biographer as well. He didn't talk to Walter for a period of time until I think Walter invited him to when Walter was the editor of Time magazine, to the all-time Time 100 or something like that. And Walter said even the 30 Years' War had to come to an end. But then apparently he said, but my wife thinks the 100 Years' War. But again, what it really drove home to me was how Kissinger was preparing constantly. I mean, he was always, even as a young professor at Harvard, he ran this summer session where he gathered up and coming leaders from all around the world to Harvard. They were all privileged to go there. He would bring in others. He was constantly building relationships. And lo and behold, when he ends up as the National Security Advisor and then the Secretary of State, he already knew many of these people, already had really quite deep relationships. And more importantly, he had a vision of the world and of balance of power and realpolitik and all the rest of that, that gave him the intellectual capital, the foundation on which you could build the various policies that he had to come up with during that period in time. Hamilton by Ron Chernow, a much more recent book, one that describes and really, I guess, in some ways revives the reputation of a man. Of course, his life was cut short assassinated by the then sitting Vice President of the United States. Those were the days. And certainly someone who had some missteps, and again, he had some complexities to him as well, but the sheer brilliance, the sheer contributions that he made to our country as the Secretary of the Treasury after being Washington's right-hand man during the Revolution and so forth. Again, a truly extraordinary life, and one that drives home once again and again, really, that leadership really does matter. And that is, everything is not preordained by any respect. Yes, there is a context. Yes, you have to understand that context. Yes, it limits what leaders might be able to do in certain situations. But at the end of the day, leaders absolutely do matter. Path Between the Seas by David McCullough, just because you have to have a David McCullough book on there. I was torn between Adams or 76, whichever. But, a 2-time or 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner has to make the list. But I chose that because I was actually in Panama. I was working as a speechwriter for General Jack Galvin. He was the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Southern Command, as the title was then. And he gave me this book, and I devoured it during that time. And I used to, on Saturday afternoon, we worked 6 days a week, when we'd finally, because there was a theater at war. I mean, you had El Salvador, the Salvadoran counterinsurgency, you had Colombia, you had Peru with the shining. I mean, it was really quite an extraordinary period as all of us were focused on the Cold War and on Germany. Here was, I remember going to the first briefing, and I was almost shaken coming out of it. I realized, wow, these guys are actually fighting throughout the theater. But on Saturday evenings, I'd go down to the Panama Canal and I would just sit and watch and marvel at all of these bespoke little devices and train cars and all the rest of that, not to mention the ships made just for the canal. As it went through it was really a minuet as it all worked together, and then marvel at how this was all built at the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century. But again, sheer will of Teddy Roosevelt, some Machiavellian activities in there as well, to be sure. Would have made Henry Kissinger proud in that regard. And I say that again with great admiration, having to have a few Machiavellian moments myself in some tough times. I mean, you do have to figure out how to maneuver at certain times. But again, just a very, very memorable summer, made even more so by the sense of history that was provided by a truly great book, not strictly just a biography about Teddy Roosevelt, although he clearly was the protagonist. And then finally, I think another, you just have to have Doris Kearns Goodwin on the list. Team of Rivals, I think, is arguably her best book. There are some competition for that about LBJ and so forth. But just the beautiful description of the masterful leadership of Lincoln. And finally, actually, I forgot to mention Power Broker, or I forgot to write down, thanks for the questions in advance, by the way. We should acknowledge to the students, this is not all just right off the cuff. I hope you can see that I'm reading something. But Robert Caro's great book on Robert Moses. Again, a book that Moses didn't necessarily love, I'm sure, but one about how someone very, very skillfully built so much of what we see around us in New York and New York State these days. Some good, some not so good. But the story of that I found captivating. It was required reading, actually, at the then Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs for the understanding of how government works and how leaders work within government. And again, a very good one. But if I could, Vance, I also want to add two other categories, which actually weren't on your questions. One is that I think what might be termed historical fiction biographies deserve some attention. And I'd offer here, for example, the General by C.S. Forrester, a very slim little book. It describes this quite admirable general, I think a division commander or so in World War I, British general. And he's not one of the chateau generals. He shares hardship and risk with his soldiers. He's very intent on doing the right thing, not on what he's going to eat that night or his next medal or award. So again, in many, many respects, someone here who you can admire, except that he never, ever grasped the nature of World War I. He never understood. He decided, well, if we had 4 divisions that attacked over a 4-kilometer front with a 30-minute artillery prep of, say 6 battalions, and that wasn't enough, clearly we need to have 8 divisions over a 2-kilometer front with a 1-hour prep of 12 battalions. And literally, it captures the essence of the failure of leadership in World War I, again, fictional, but could be applied to a number of figures that literally ground an entire generation of Sandhurst graduates, St. Cyr graduates from France, the military academy, and so forth, not to mention hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the mud of the Somme of Passchendaele. And, a word like that should actually mean something, certainly to a professional soldier. And again, it was a failure of leadership. The reason why about Cardigan and Raglan in Crimea, this is what gave rise to the Into the Valley of Death road, the 600. And the sheer level of venality, of incompetence, of ego, that you would command your troops while on your vessel, this luxury yacht parked in the harbor, and you'd sort of ride up to the troops every now and then and see how it's going, and then retreat back in time for tea and pre-dinner drinks. Again, it captures the essence of that time, of that British system. And of course, it was one of the catalysts, that experience was a catalyst for significant change in how the British Army was structured, recruited, and all the rest of that. But it captures it beautifully. Killer Angels, of course, another great one, which captures, again, this is about a real figure. And I think there's no book that better describes the tactical actions that can be taken at the level of a colonel that can literally be strategically decisive. And not just strategically decisive for the Battle of Gettysburg, as Chamberlain recognized that Little Round Top, had to be seized. He seized it just minutes before the Confederates recognized the value of it, held it through multiple attacks by the Confederates. And when they ran out of ammunition, his troops of the main regiment charged the enemy and literally ran them down the hill, and literally probably saved the Union cause, at least on that first day, and maybe for the entire battle. And of course, that battle in many respects was not just the high water mark of the Confederacy, it was also a very decisive battle indeed at the end of the day. And then again, a little bit more recent times, The Centurions by Jean Lardigue, as a student of counterinsurgency, to read about the French experience, which I've done a lot, about what they did in Indochine in Vietnam. And now this was in Algeria. And very, very clearly, the figure in the book, Raspagy, is actually based on a hero of mine, Marcel Bijard, whose photo I have, an inscribed photo. All I wanted for Christmas one year from my wife's father, who was a 4-star at NATO at the time, was actually a signed photograph from General Bijard. And I remember my father asked the French military representative if he could get one of those, and he said, of course. And my father-in-law said, but please be sure that it has all of his medals. And the French general said, but of course, all of his photos have all of his medals. So again, but a truly extraordinary figure, and one that I've had on the wall for decades, because it just reminds you of sort of the essence of the leadership. There were a lot of real leadership tactics, techniques, and procedures that book conveyed, in addition to some of the political stuff that was, the talk of France in those days, which you should speed your way through. And then finally, if I could, when it comes to autobiographies, I think Dean Acheson's President at the Creation is a true classic. How the post-World War II world was literally constructed by a handful of great American leaders, some in uniform, some not. I think Colonel Dean Rusk, who later was, of course, the Secretary of State, in uniform as a colonel, helped literally draw boundaries on maps. It was that kind of moment. Of course, it's when the Cold War actually evolved, and all of these early doctrines and so forth were developed. And I think, again, a must really on anyone's list. Henry Kissinger's own memoirs, obviously, have to be read. And then I'd offer others, Brzezinski, also a 4-year national security advisor as well, right after Kissinger, was equally good, and a number since then. And then, of course, the autobiographies, again, of those in my profession. Westmoreland, I was in the post-Vietnam era. He was the prominent commander during that time. Maxwell Taylor, a hero of World War II, later Korea, and in many respects, a prominent figure in so many different ways, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs briefly, then as the ambassador to Vietnam. Again, a lot of this connected with Vietnam. My great hero and mentor, General Jack Galvin, I mentioned earlier, I worked for him 3 different times personally, which is very rare in a military career. The final time when he was the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, again, as his speechwriter. Really became almost a father figure in many respects to me. I wrote the foreword for his autobiography years later, and in fact, gave the eulogy at his funeral. A truly extraordinary soldier, statesman, scholar, who in many respects, again, I tried to emulate over the years, although I could never bring it myself to only show 2 rows of decorations as he did. I allowed mine to continue to creep up until there was no more room. And then, of course, Colin Powell, Bob Gates, a greatest Secretary of Defense. I used to call him the Secretary of War because he was the Secretary of Defense as I was the commander of the war in Iraq and Central Command, and then later the war in Afghanistan, each of those at their height. So again, I'd add those additional 2 categories if I could. I know there are limited days and nights and all the rest of that for you, but I think it's worth considering some of those just because they are so instructive, they are so intellectually challenging and fulfilling and thought-provoking, and they help you, again, assemble what you're trying to gain from these, I think, which is the intellectual capital on which you will draw many, many years, decades later, when that call comes, for Petraeus or Surchuk for field marshal. And hopefully at that point in time, you can validate the old saying that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You do need to be prepared. And this kind of reading is among the most valuable ways to prepare.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. First, I've already composed the note to Roger, informing him that in addition to the course on great biography and great leaders, we will be also clearly initiating the seminar on historical fiction,
Yes.
which hopefully I expect you'll be leading. But I'm really struck by many of the things that you said. But this idea that biography and autobiography is this incredibly rich subject for anyone who finds himself or herself in any position of authority or aspires to it. Just how provocative, rewarding, meaningful, insightful. And part of the impetus for the course really was the observation that, with rare exceptions, and I'm glad that you cited the Robert Moses, which you encountered when you were at the Woodrow Wilson School, formerly the Woodrow Wilson School, at Princeton. For the most part, at least in my own educational experience, I did not encounter biography. I was struck by how little in the course of studying history, law, international relations that was taught in an academic setting, versus how much I actually found when I was in a very minor position of responsibility, how meaningful it was for me. And frankly, how valuable it was for me to be reading some of the books that you cited, because of the ways in which history may not repeat itself, but so often it does have a tendency to rhyme. I want to ask you, though, you mentioned at the very beginning the Cadden, the great Cadden work on Grant. And I'm curious, as you've looked back on your time in uniform, your time in command, were there specific things that you drew from the study of biography, from books that you'd read, that you then directly applied?
Yeah, very much so.
Moment?
Sure. Yeah, again, there are lots and lots of sort of tactics and techniques about leadership that you pick up. I'll talk a bit later about the tasks that a strategic leader has to perform and so forth. And the most important, of course, is to get the big ideas right, the strategy, and so forth. And we'll go into that. And this helps, I think, to, again, when you're in that process. But you then also later on have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. And that's where all these tactics and techniques and, how do you stroke people? How do you encourage them? How do you prod them? How do you hire and attract and reward and incentivize and encourage, inspire? All of this stuff, I think, is actually very, very important. But it's beyond that. And when we go back to revisit again, Grant takes command. Here I am in the most important task I ever was privileged to undertake in my life, commanding the surge in Iraq. It was a desperate situation. Iraq was on the verge of a full-blown Sunni Shia civil war. There are 53 dead civilian bodies found on the streets of Iraq every 24 hours. That's civilians. That's not military, police, other enemy casualties or anything like that. It was a country that was out of control. And again, a decision by a president that was hugely courageous against his own advisors, generally against the views of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, ultimately against the view of the boss who I took command under, and then his replacement within a couple of weeks. So it was a really unique situation, and you are alone. There is no other four-star in Iraq. Yes, you have an ambassador, he's your partner, but he's got his own set of problems. We have had a lot of problems that we shared, to be sure, problems in common, but a lot of these were strictly our problems. And if we didn't achieve security, nothing else was possible. Security was the foundation for everything, and it was completely lacking. And we had to completely reverse what it was we were doing. Sometimes I had to explain to our own commanders that, we really do have to pursue reconciliation with as many of the rank and file of the insurgents as we can, even as we intensify the targeted operations by special operations units to go after the irreconcilables, the leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Sunni insurgents and Shia militia. But so again, you can't really overstate the magnitude of this, actually. And if you remember that tumultuous 6-month hearing that the ambassador and I went through, we had congressional delegations. They generally thought this was a waste that the war was lost. You may recall the Senate Majority Leader actually said the war was lost publicly. So again, the rucksack had a lot of rocks in it, and a few more than normal. And it was wonderful to be able to retreat and read a few pages every night about somebody else who went through that type of experience, and somebody who could see the battlefield, who could develop the vision, those big ideas, who did so at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels uniquely in our US Army's history, who had this unbelievable preternatural calm during battle, enormous physical courage, but it was all very, very quiet. There was not a demonstrable individual. There was no chest beating, no cheerleading. He could write orders that were just absolutely clear. He could see not just the terrain, but he could see how he wanted it to unfold in time as well as in space. And he could then convey that. Keep in mind, this was an era where there weren't, lots of staff officers. You basically had a handful of aides, and their job actually was to take the messages you wrote longhand, copy them for a record, and then take them to the respective general to whom they were supposed to be delivered on the battlefield. And he had this incredible ability, but above all, he had this indomitable determination, just sheer will. And it was something that inspired the entire army. It was something that brought the best out in those around him. Sherman, who you may recall, in fact, Sherman famously said, Grant stood by me while I was mad, and I stood by him while he was drunk. That's a little of an overstatement, the latter part, but Sherman did have his moments of enormous depression, and Grant was his rock, and that team was so important. But it's best captured by the first day at Shiloh, which the only time that Sherman and Grant, completely surprised by the Confederates, they were preparing the Union forces to go on the offensive to attack, and the Confederates attacked them before they could do that. They were not ready. They didn't recognize it. They didn't see it as the full-out offensive that it actually was. They were almost driven back into the Tennessee River. A very, very bloody day, heavy casualties on both sides. The Union literally sort of clinging to the banks of the river that night as Grant is desperately trying to get the Union boats on the Tennessee River to deliver reinforcements so they could shore up their position and perhaps even go on the offensive the next day. The cries of the wounded still out on the battlefield. He's outside because every available shelter is being used as a makeshift hospital. He can hear the cries of those whose limbs are being hacked off, in many cases without the kind of, morphine or whatever that we would have today. And out of the dark comes Sherman. Grant standing under a tree, got his slouch hat on. There's a fine rain and it's dripping slowly off his hat. So has a stub of a cigar in his mouth, as he always did. And Sherman says, "Well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" Grant says, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And that was it. And we had horrible days in Baghdad, 150 innocent civilians killed in 3 suicide bombings in 3 separate markets. And these were our lick 'em tomorrow moments. And I actually used that particular story, and it became a bit of a rallying cry. We became the lick 'em tomorrow, and that kind of, again, infectious determination. We normally talk about infectious enthusiasm. That wasn't it. This is just sheer will, that we've got to be tough, determined, and we have to hang in there. And he had that perhaps more than any other commander, certainly in the Civil War and perhaps beyond. And it was one of his extraordinary qualities. And that, again, clearly you can see that that was a very important element actually for me personally, as I was going through the most important task I ever undertook, which was leading the surge in Iraq.
Let me ask you a different question about biography. Is there a figure, one of the things which I've reflected on is that there are individuals whose biographies I read when I was younger, and I've subsequently reread the biography, and I've actually looked at them in a completely different light because of subsequent experiences that I myself have had. I'm curious if there's any figures that you've encountered that subsequent to the experiences that you had in Iraq and Afghanistan, at CENTCOM, at the CIA, that when you looked at them anew, you brought something new to your perspective on them. You looked at them differently.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry to keep coming back to Grant, but I sort of have to, because keep in mind that in my own lifetime, of course, the historiography of Grant was also very interesting, that you had in the first half or beyond. When I went to West Point,
he was a drunk. He was an
the U.S. Military Academy. This is the Federal Academy. We read about the great Robert E. Lee. He was clearly the gifted, inspirational, saintly figure in the Civil War. And Lee just, he sort of, the North had more industry and had more people and had more money. And so inevitably, and of course, he had a little drinking problem, and there are a few other things. It was as if Grant almost stumbled to victory. And as I read this more and more and more, I came to appreciate that this is absolutely wrong. Of course, it was also falsehoods. I mean, it was the lost cause mythology that was perpetuated during the years of segregation in the South. It was all part of the Daughters of the Confederacy and these others who were busy erecting monuments to their heroes. It was, Washington and Lee College, where the two founders of our country, Washington and Lee, they have Lee Chapel. There's not even a cross in it. There's just a marble bust of Lee on a sarcophagus, I guess, or what have you. And, with a hand on a sword, he's ready to spring to the defense again. And so there is some of that was just the sheer realization that the history that I had been taught actually, and the Douglas Southall Freemans of the world who elevated Robert E. Lee and so forth, and defended him and made this out of states' rights instead of states' rights to enslave others. That was quite important. But then the real appreciation actually came, once again, when I was truly, the strategic leader, and being bombarded with questions from the White House, when are we going to see legislation? I said, legislation? These people can't even get to work alive. They can't take their kids to school. I mean, we got to do some serious work in the security realm. And we were reversing the entire approach that we had 180 degrees before in Congress, of course, with their patience running out, the Republicans having just lost control of the Senate, and many of them, including the great Senator Warner, in many respects, a hero of mine over many, many years. He was Senate Armed Services Committee chairman when I was the executive officer to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I saw that wonderful relationship and so forth. But even he ultimately, and so, the pressure is really quite extraordinary. Maybe I can capture it best because, again, this causes another reappraisal of Grant, and by the way, of others who, of Eisenhower. And again, this is not the great crusade, to save democracy in World War II, but again, the loneliness of command, or whatever you might want to call it, is present regardless. But I remember in the final few days of the command there, the chief warrant officer, who was my security guard, and I went out one night. It was very secure in this huge compound. You recall Camp Victory with the artificial lake that Saddam had built and all that stuff. And so we didn't need all the security detail. And occasionally I'd just go out late at night. Late for us is 10:30 because, you're getting up at 5:15 or something every single day of the week, 7 days a week. And I just think about things, and I might jot a few notes. I always took a pen and a 3x5 card. But this night, the chief came up, and he was with me in multiple combat tours, a really great man in a great relationship, personally as well as professionally. And he said, "Sir, I wonder if I could ask you a question tonight." I said, "Sure, Chief, absolutely." He said, what has it been like? What's it been like to command the surge? You know, everyone doubted it. They criticized the idea, the concept. You attacked you personally. You know, MoveOn.org's full page ad in the New York Times on the morning of the 6-month testimony. Again, all of the, you know, all these presidential candidates and so forth and so on, because it was a presidential campaign year. What has it been like? Tough casualties, setbacks. You know, just when you think things are going well, the insurgents drop the entire bridge that the British built a century ago in the center of the Tigris River between East and West Baghdad, or, you know, on and on. And I said, well, Chief, look, it has been the most awesome experience imaginable on a good day. But there have been less than this many good days during the last 19 and a half months that we've been together. So again, you really do appreciate then what it is that these other figures went through. And again, that sort of loneliness, and, you know, especially at night when you realize this thing's really hard, and you have a deadline that you must have progress by, or, you know, you were a Senate staffer at the time. The Senate was only a few votes away from cloture to perhaps restrict or even cut off funding of the war. So yeah, I think that your own experiences, and it goes back and forth, and that's what I've actually enjoyed going back to reread biographies of and autobiographies as well of some of those leaders about whom I had an assessment, but then you want to reassess to some degree. And, you know, the other thing is that you, I think, do appreciate is that leaders have imperfections. You know, they have strengths and weaknesses. There are shortcomings. There's brilliance. There's blind spots. They can be noble and petty. And again, they can go through really tough times. And I think at the end of the day, what I've always looked for is how does the leader deal with adversity? I remember working for certain leaders who, God, they could really demonstrate the full range of emotions at the drop of a hat. But one of them in particular, who was just extraordinary, when it was a real crisis, there was none of that. All of that acting stopped. And it was just absolute, let's everybody calm, you know, let's work through this. Let's determine what the facts are, bring it all in, let's assemble, let's do this, let's do that. And again, everyone got very, very calm and cool as a result of that. We used to call it battlefield cool as well, because that's what you want in a real serious firefight. That's not when you want the screamer to be in charge. That's when you want the quiet, competent, cool, capable, yet again, also somewhat determined and tenacious. And I think how individuals deal with adversity really is, at the end of the day, is the measure of the man or the woman, because life is not full of high five moments. Units make mistakes, individuals do, the leaders do, they make personal mistakes. I've obviously experienced some of this. And I think at the end of the day, it's, you know, how do you pick yourself back up, dust yourself off and get back in the ring and start swinging again, or pick up the rucksack and start putting one foot in front of the other and repeating the process. I think that actually really is the measure of the individual.
I want to ask you a question which actually came from the floor, and which I think is a really good one. How much value do you see, and how interesting do you see the study of the early years of people who go on to achieve greatness?
It's fascinating. Again, as I mentioned with Henry Kissinger, what I really took from Kissinger was that, look, this guy knew where he was going to end up at some point in time. He didn't know precisely what the circumstances were. And it's interesting, of course, because in some ways he had, to a degree, hitched his star to Nelson Rockefeller, as you know. Yes. He was his advisor. Rockefeller didn't win the nomination. And so he was somewhat cast about. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, Nixon calls him up and almost announces it before Kissinger even realized that he had sort of been hired or had the, so, but he was ready for that moment. It was, you know, Kissinger for field marshal. And so that sense, Andrew Roberts has written another great biography of Churchill, would be Walking with Destiny. And he talks about how Churchill, did seem, and he knew that he was destined for greatness. This moment was going to come. And he was constantly working, to how do you build toward this? Now, again, it's not all Machiavellian. I mean, he really did like to get together with intellectually interesting and challenging and thoughtful individuals. And he created the Other Club, as you may recall. And they used to get together and gather, and, there would be a few people added and a few would move on and so forth. But again, Churchill was constantly preparing for that moment when he might truly be needed. And of course, his skills as a writer, as an orator, as a thinker, really even as a micromanager. But I mean, because he just drove these campaigns, and he had to occasionally be told, Prime Minister, thank you very much. Could you please sit under a tree until that thought passed? This kind of thing. So yeah, I think, again, there's a great book about Teddy Roosevelt, Mornings on Horseback, which I think is also by McCullough.
Yeah, it is.
And again, I was fascinated by that. The upbringing of people also matters. Some of them, like Teddy Roosevelt, have a pretty privileged upbringing. Others are scrabbling. And so you're constantly, I think, gaining insights about individuals, how they develop themselves, and what is it that they do to sort of spur themselves on. And I can tell your audience, for example, I used to believe that I should publicly declare really tough goals periodically just to force myself to do something, such as, okay, I'm going to grad school. West Point's sending me because I'm going to teach there. I tell my future boss at West Point, I'm not just going to do the master's degree in the 2 years I'm allowed to be at grad school. I'm going to double up, and I'm going to do all the coursework and all the general exams and the orals for the PhD, and get the dissertation prospectus approved before I leave, and the language exam and a few other things. And I cursed myself. I made what should have been a really great 2 years into a real tough period, but I did do that, and I would not have otherwise. I told another at the Command and General Staff College, you had to give your goals while you were there during the academic year. And one of them was I was going to break 3 hours in the marathon. I'd only run one marathon before. It was a 3:09. I thought I could do this, but again, you got to really train for this. And I ended up running a 2:50:50. But again, on those long runs, I was wondering, why in the world did I do this? We just had our first child. The academics actually were a bit more time consuming than I thought they might be, and so forth. I think it is worth periodically doing that. I still do that. I'm going to go to cycling camp this summer in Aspen, and I got to, you got to train up for that, be serious, to clip in with Christian van de Velde. He was a fourth in the Tour de France one time. And so again, just so you don't embarrass yourself at something like that. So, but I know you do the same thing. And again, I think this is worthwhile. I think it's a useful technique.
No, that's great. I love that. And the Andrew Roberts biography of Churchill. So the plan for the first year for the seminar, one of the two biographies we're going to take on is exactly that one. And
oh, it's a great one. But I've interviewed him, 4 or 5 times on it and on various. And by the way, the reason I do that is because it forces me to read the darn book.
That's right.
In fact, the very first one was the New York Historical Society, and it was, I think, again, that particular lecture series. But those are valuable. In fact, I must mention that, in fact, in 1 minute, I have to be on the virtual stage of the 92nd Street Y to interview Jane Harmon on her great book, along with Senator Susan Collins.
And that's why, on that note, I will say, for those of us who are not privileged to be able to lead the conversation directly with Andrew Roberts on the stage of the 92nd Street Y, this seminar will provide the next best experience. In the interim, Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure. Really a privilege to be with you. And thanks to you and obviously to Roger.
Fantastic. Have a great evening. Thanks all.
You bet. You too.